Have you heard about this fascinating new study about forgiveness? Well, I'm really kind of hoping you haven't. Let me tell you why. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. There's going to be a couple of different pieces to this that I want to talk about, and one is the reality about forgiveness. But the reason that I'm saying that I hope you haven't heard about this study is primarily because it's not real. So I was on social media and I came across this and I ended up doing a little bit of digging into it. And this is part of the challenge that we have with social media, influencers, coaching, and all of it being kind of intertwined with mental health. This so-called study doesn't exist. The person, Dr. Laura Zhang, apparently doesn't exist, at least not in the context in which it's being purported. Supposedly, she created a study. She's supposed to be out of Stanford, and she supposedly created a study of 600 people that she followed over several years. I don't remember how long exactly, and came to some conclusions. And it turns out that none of it is based in fact. Not one piece of it. Not even the person who supposedly did the research. And this is problematic on so many different levels. But so many people get their information, try to gain understanding and try to gain tools from social media and from AI quite often now. And part of the difficulty with this that I was looking into is that because this is growing on social media, AI is picking up on it. And so if somebody's doing a search, even though this information is not accurate, there isn't an actual paper out there, because there are people talking about it and saying things about it, AI can potentially pick up on it and it can be inaccurate. And that is true for any sort of thing that blows up on social media around mental health. So even people that have no experience, no training, no education on different things, if other people start sharing that and start talking about it, it's hard to know what is real and what isn't. And so, interestingly, in the supposed research, from what I can gather, the primary thing that tends to be showing up is that 34% of the 600 people who forgave ended up having significant boundary violations or something along that line. And I have talked about forgiveness quite a few times, and I've done at least one video, very specific video, on whether or not forgiveness is necessary. And I'll try to share a link in the description if I remember. And it's not, just to say that up front. But what is concerning is that even though I don't believe that forgiveness is necessary, and this supposed study is kind of suggesting that forgiveness can be sometimes problematic, which on just that statement by itself, I don't disagree with at all. The problem is that it's so hard to know what is truth, what is based in fact. Not even necessarily what is based in science, going back to last week, but what is based in fact, what is based in practice, what is based in the reality of what we're talking about in the context of what we're talking about it in. And so I'm sharing this with you because I know I've created kind of warnings about things before, but we are really in a time that's only going to be escalated. when I was looking at stuff, what I was coming up with were a lot of short videos and posts on Instagram and some on TikTok, and I think a couple on Facebook. But Instagram actually seemed to be the primary place where they were stating the study and then they were trying to sell something. And from what I could tell, I didn't do deep dives into those particular profiles, but just kind of looking at it, it all looked like AI. They even had kind of a similar theme, and what they were selling ultimately might have been the same thing, but I think maybe calling it something different, or maybe other people are picking up on it and trying to make some money off of it as well. I don't know, but creating something with AI and then trying to sell it. So I do want to caution you again, because it is only going to get harder to discern what is accurate, what is correct, who to trust online as time goes on, because AI is getting really, really good at making it hard to tell the difference between what is real and what isn't. And with social media, and I've talked about this many times, but with social media and so many people talking about mental health and people building coaching businesses or selling courses or whatever the case might be, especially with AI, because it's so easy to create something. I'm concerned, honestly. And I'm also angry because whether it's a real person doing it or a real person, I guess ultimately it's going to be a real person, at least at this particular point, creating an AI thing. It's people who are just trying to get likes, make money off of very real and important and potentially harmful information and material. And I use AI for some different things. I think there's a lot of great things that it can be beneficial for. But when you don't necessarily know what to look for or what to know is right or not in terms of correct, or whether it's something made up or something that just doesn't make sense, for most people, you don't necessarily know that. You can't necessarily know what is correct and what isn't, especially when it starts getting pushed out by different people and pages and platforms and all of that. And there are people on YouTube, absolutely a lot of people on TikTok and also on Instagram and Facebook, where this is really becoming very, very common. And so I want to talk just kind of briefly, and I've shared this before, but when you are consuming content, trying to consume content from people that you can do some research on. It doesn't have to be lengthy, but even just kind of doing a search, like searching for their name, looking up what their credentials mean. For example, I am no longer a licensed clinician. I retired my license. So my credentials now, I have MSW as my only credential. And that is a degree. I have a master's in social work. And I'm not suggesting that you have to have a degree in order to have a platform and be somebody who shares things. However, I do think it's important that that person is honest and upfront about what their perspective is and what their knowledge comes from. And if it's somebody talking about being somebody who can help you heal your trauma, or somebody that purports to be an expert, or this is the thing that you need to do to heal, even if they're not suggesting that they're an expert, it's important to consider the source. It doesn't mean that those people can't have value or add value to your journey. It doesn't mean that at all. It's important as consumers of information to just understand the hierarchy of where, like how much of that to take in, right? Kind of like if you have a friend that has had some symptoms that are similar to yours, you might listen to your friend and find out what the outcome for that person was, or what they maybe did to help. And you might take that in and think, oh, maybe I can try that. But if that person maybe is still struggling a little bit, or there's something about it that seems a little bit different, or maybe it's something that's serious, maybe you would actually seek out a doctor, a physician who is practicing currently and has some knowledge base in that type of thing that you can go to, because a physician, a practicing physician, we would generally, they're not always, I understand that, same with therapists, same with any profession, honestly, lawyer, but we know that they have an education. We know that they have experience. We know that there's a good chance they have treated other people with these circumstances. That all combined is helpful information to have when making your own informed decision versus somebody who's experienced something similar and this is what worked for them. Not that you completely dismiss that, but you take that in combination with this information that hopefully will carry a little bit more weight. And if it doesn't feel right to you, it's not working, then you see somebody else that has expertise. And one of the challenges, again, with mental health is that there isn't a lot of science to back things up. And so a lot of it is opinion. I was in one of the therapy groups, and I actually thought about doing a video on this specifically or on its own, because I just thought it was kind of interesting, and especially the timing. But somebody was asking about what are your go-to interventions for somebody dealing with shame. And in reading some of the comments at that point, there weren't that many. I think there were maybe like about 15 or something. But as I read that, I thought, well, I certainly have ideas, but it kind of depends. It depends on where this person is on their journey. It depends on what the shame is coming from. There's factors that go into that. But I read the comments and it was just interesting to see. So this is a group of supposed therapists. So I believe everybody in there is supposed to be a therapist. And I'm in there because I have experience as a licensed therapist. But there were so many different responses. People had very different ideas about how you approach it. Now, granted, the question was about what are your go-to interventions, so nobody was saying this is the only thing to do. But it was just interesting because there were a variety of ideas and very different approaches to working with somebody who is struggling with shame. And my perspective did not fit any of them. So thinking again about that hierarchy, right? Would you see, if you're dealing with a particular type of symptoms or a set of symptoms, would you see a family doctor versus a specialist? And I know sometimes you have to see a family doctor first before you can see a specialist here in the US. Actually, I think most places, it's how it works. But that's an important difference too, right? Like if you're somebody who's healing from childhood trauma, working with somebody who specializes in childhood trauma. If you're having cardiovascular issues, it's important to see a cardiologist. If you're having endocrine issues, it's important to see an endocrinologist, right? Like a family physician is good for general things and to maybe direct you where you need to go. But if you have very specific issues, it's important to work with somebody around those specific issues. So it's important, again, to think about where you're getting this information and how much do you put into accepting that information? How much do you allow that information to influence how you think, what you feel, or what you choose to do in your life, in your healing, in your relationships, and in the choices that you make and the practices that you engage in around healing and around mental health generally? Because it is, like, I find myself sometimes not really being sure. I do consume different types of medical information online, and there are times that I will do some research on somebody to find out who they really are and what their experience is, because what they're saying is significant and potentially quite impactful, and not just for me, but for anybody listening. And I guess I kind of always have that hat on of thinking about the impact on people watching or listening, but I will do that to get a sense of that, because it is important, and it is, again, harder to really know. And when it comes to mental health, again, because there isn't a lot of science-backed data that can show us absolutes, because it's just, humans are so different, and it's really hard to get that, because even something that does have some science behind it isn't going to work or be as effective or even applicable to all different kinds of situations at particular times, especially. So just be conscious, be cautious of those things as you are consuming content. And if you have questions, ask them of that person. Ask a comment in their comments, or ask a question in their comments. And then I did want to just kind of also follow up a little bit about the idea of forgiveness, in part certainly because of this, but also because, as I've mentioned many times, we're in a time where all of us, because we're surrounded by all of this energy, especially, well, it's just one more thing, day after day after day, it's one more thing. But we're all experiencing this energy, which, when I talk about vulnerability and how things impact us, right? So any vulnerability already means that things are going to affect us more. The more things that add stress or vulnerability, or we're tired, or we're feeling uncertain about things, there's something not going well in our life, we're not feeling well physically, all of that adds to our vulnerability. And oftentimes, when we are feeling vulnerable, especially when we feel uncertain and unsafe, we tend to, especially depending on where we are on this healing journey, we often tend to kind of naturally revert back to things that we know, even if those things don't feel good. And this is part of the challenge of coping mechanisms, because even if a coping mechanism leaves us feeling ashamed, it doesn't necessarily work, maybe it makes us feel bad in some way, because it can be what we're used to and what we know, when we're having a little bit of a harder time, feeling more vulnerable, excuse me, it's natural for us to go back to those things that we know as an automatic way of responding, of trying to have some normalcy, of having things that feel a little bit more certain, even if not good. And so in this time, it is very kind of easy, sometimes automatic, to find yourself reverting to things that maybe you've kind of moved away from. And that could be coping mechanisms. It could be finding yourself wanting to reconnect with people that you've set boundaries around. It could be you even saying, well, right now, this is like, I feel like going back to this thing that I know outweighs the progress I'm trying to make, in part maybe because you feel like you're not making progress, or you might even be feeling bad because you're struggling more than you thought that you should be. So it's very natural for people to return to things and to relationships that are not particularly helpful, but because it's known, it can feel better. It can even feel safer. So having said that, what can happen is that people will return to relationships or circumstances that are not particularly good for them. And with the idea of forgiveness, there are a lot of people struggling with that right now. There's always people struggling with it when it comes to survivors of childhood trauma. But one of the areas where it's coming up quite a bit is for people that you feel disappointed in, feel people that have betrayed you or betrayed your trust, being surrounded by people or having somebody that really matters to you in your life who rationalizes and excuses sexual assault or lawlessness, just can support the really horrific things that are going on. That can be really challenging, and there can be this natural pull to want to forgive and move forward. And maybe this time it will be different. And so I just want you to be really conscious of that as you're making any sorts of decisions around that, recognizing that it makes sense that you might be feeling yourself being pulled in that direction. You might be feeling yourself really craving relationships that maybe you've tried to set some boundaries around, and feeling, kind of saying to yourself, well, maybe enough time has passed, or maybe I'm in a better place and I can set better boundaries. And sometimes that can happen. But when your vulnerability is already heightened, it's harder to do those things. So just try to stay mindful of that. If you do notice that it's coming up, and certainly be really mindful, conscious, and discerning of the kind of information that you are consuming, because it is going to continue to get harder and harder to tell the difference. So I hope that this has been helpful. If you have seen any content related to that supposed study, and I don't know that the study had a name. I didn't see a name of a study attached to it, other than the supposed doctor, Laura Zhang, I think her name was. But it was just on forgiveness and 600 people over, I think, several years. So if you come across that, just kind of be aware. And remember that when it comes to forgiveness, it is not necessary. You do not have to forgive anybody in order to heal. You do not owe your forgiveness to anybody. If you are hurt by somebody, you do not owe them your forgiveness, especially if they're not asking, especially if they're not taking accountability. I'm not saying that you should not forgive. However, I think that if you are going to forgive, it's really beneficial to work through a lot of healing before you decide to do that. And that can mean a lot of different things for different people, the idea of forgiveness. But know that you absolutely can heal without forgiving. And I do think, and I've shared this before, but I do know that there are people that have believed that they have forgiven and will even say, I did that for me so that I can go on, so that I can heal. And what I have seen happen in my work in that regard is that they so deeply want to forgive. There might even be a part of them that, based often on religion, they believe that they have to forgive in order to be a good person or to go to heaven or to be forgiven themselves. That oftentimes, certainly way more often than not, in those situations, that forgiveness has actually created additional difficulty for them. So, well, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts, what you notice coming up for you in the comments. I'd love to connect with you. Thanks so much for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you soon.